As the most historically foundational and systematic critic of capitalism to date, Karl Marx remains our contemporary. Marxism, as Jean-Paul Sartre once wrote, remains the philosophy of our time because we have not gone beyond the circumstances which engendered it. Every era after Marx has reinvented his ideas to fit its needs. The present era, inaugurated by the 2008 financial crisis, is no exception. There is not one Marx forever and for all time, just as there is not one theory of capitalism, materialism, or communism for all time. There are 1,000 Marxes. In fact, one of the greatest insights and contributions of Marx's work is that it treats theory itself as a historical practice. Marxism is not just an interpretive activity, but a creative one. As our historical conditions, including new knowledge in physics, economics, ecology, culture, and so on, change, so do the kinds of questions we pose and the kinds of answers we find. Marx in Motion is a contribution to a 21st century return to Marx. The return, found in this book, however, is not a return to Marxism, which focuses on Marx's historical reception. This book is a return to the writings of Marx, read again through the lens of the pressing philosophical and political problems of our time. Most notably, ecological crisis, gender inequality, colonial appropriation, and global mobility. The aim of this book is not to supplement or correct the apparent deficiencies or anachronisms of Marx's writings, or even to make his theory relevant by applying it to contemporary issues. These interventions have their place, but they are not the focus here. Rather, my aim in this book is to return to the writings of Marx himself and to read them again, as if they were absolutely contemporary. The outcome is neither an update of an old Marx nor a new application, but a different Marx altogether. More specifically, this book reads Marx as a philosopher of movement and motion, inspired by his earliest dissertation writings. From this unique perspective, I argue that Marx was not a historical determinist, reductionist materialist, anthropocentric humanist, or structuralist, and he did not hold a labor theory of value. These bold claims strike at the heart of well-trod interpretations of Marx and motivate my rereading of him as a process philosopher of motion and a new materialist avant la lettre. The aim of this introduction is to contextualize this intervention and introduce the theses, methods, and consequences of this project. I wrote this book on the 200th anniversary of Marx's birth, but I would like to begin by diagnosing the cause of his apparent death, for it is only in his death that he can be born again. It is only in the movement of the decline of Marxism that a swerve to a 21st century Marx is possible. The decline of Marxism. Prior to the 2008 financial crisis, Marxism as a political ideology had been in decline since the 1970s. There are many reasons for this. However, 3 reasons stand out as major criticisms upon which Marxism declined, but now makes its return. These well-established criticisms come not only from outside, but also from within Marxism itself. Historical determinism. The first axis of criticism is that Marxism subscribes to a deterministic theory of history. Various Marxisms endorsed a theory of human history that was not only entirely deterministic, but also headed toward a pre-given end. communism, the destiny of humanity. This idea did not work out. We do not need to go back too far in recent history to see that World War II, the unplanned political revolutions of 1968, the threat of global nuclear war, global climate change, and other events do not fit at all into any clear historical pattern of development or liberation. If anything, the opposite is the case. Today, our future seems bleaker than ever. There is even less evidence that anything like the lockstep necessity of communism, whatever that might look like, is on the immediate horizon. As in all great developmental historical narratives, which not coincidentally tend to be told from the perspective of their present historical achievement, the future happens. The rise of Soviet socialism came to an end. The predictions of socialist historical determinism did not come to pass, and the ironclad laws of economic necessity, the falling rate of profit, and other factors failed to hold. The supposedly universal laws of historical development and capitalism changed. Furthermore, the creation of a socialist state, party, and vanguard did not result, by historical necessity, in revolution or communism. At worst, these entities led to new forms of militarism, patriarchy, imperialism, and authoritarianism. This is not to say the opposite, that such political forms necessarily lead to their worst outcomes, only that the forms of the party and state did not dictate in any deterministic way the results that followed. Reductionism. The second axis of criticism of Marxism is that it subscribed to a falsely reductionist model defined by strictly economic causal laws. Everything, some argued, can be deduced and explained by the one-directional causal connection of an economic base, the forces of production, to the cultural superstructure of ideas, feelings, and sensations of the world, ideology, which is the strict product of reducibly economic modes of production. Even social relations such as race, gender, sexuality, animality, and nature are categories constituted by the capitalist mode of production, not the other way around. All phenomena are reducible to economic phenomena. This reductionism, however, simply assumes what needs to be explained in the first place, namely, the non-economic conditions for the emergence of economic conditions themselves. Although economic relations are undoubtedly important aspects of reality, historically, they have not always played an strictly determining role in political struggle. For example, many post-1970s liberation movements and 21st century political struggles have been focused on the intersectionality of gender, race, sexuality, animal rights, ecological, indigenous, and decolonial issues. These are certainly related to the capitalist mode of production, but are hardly completely determined by it in any reducible manner. It is not at all clear how or if such disparate movements can be understood by economic analysis alone. This led Marxism to various supplemented versions of Marx that add on critiques of nature, gender, race, and other factors. Furthermore, the very possibility of ideology critique or revolution must also entail the fact that there can be no strictly reducible relation between base and superstructure, or else one could never think or do otherwise than what is determined by such a base. In other words, critique would be pointless if determinism were actually true. Another aspect of the critique of reductionism is leveled against Marx's materialism. Reductionist materialism says that there are reducibly dialectical laws of all matter and nature. Economic laws are only one expression of a larger set of natural laws that matter follows. In this version of dialectical materialism, there is a natural developmental or evolutionary pattern followed by all matter, conceived of as discrete, actual particles. What is reductionist here is not only that everything is made of actual discrete particles, but also that matter itself is reducible to eternal laws of motion, known and knowable to science. This classical thesis, however, is no longer a tenable description of matter by the standards of 21st century physics. In quantum theory, matter is not discrete particles, but vibrating fields. Matter is not reducibly empirical or entirely knowable, much less are there any so-called universal mechanical laws of its motion below the Planck scale. Furthermore, the very idea that matter is something knowable, independent of its observation, not just human observation, is not possible because of quantum entanglement. Where Marxist science has yoked its materialism to a 19th and even 20th century idea of mechanistic materialism and so-called universal laws, it encounters the limit of quantum systems. Anthropocentrism. Insofar as Marxism grants methodological or even ontological privilege to human beings, or human social and economic structures above others, it remains incapable of dealing with one of the most important events of the 21st century, global climate change, the Copernican revolution of our time. Anthropocentrism in all its varieties remains at least partly complicit in the human-centric focus that has led to the current ecological catastrophe. However, there are at least 3 major variations on the theme of anthropocentrism in the history of Marxism that I should mention here. The first is the straightforwardly productivist version, which emphasizes the human effort to subordinate nature through technological innovation. What it means to be a human being, in this version, is to appropriate as much of nature as possible for the benefit of humanity, regardless of the ecological consequences. Supposedly, no other animal has this unique ability. Humans are special in their consciousness of their own domination of nature, hence the anthropocentrism of the term Anthropocene. The second version is more humanist in orientation and defined primarily by the sensuous enjoyment of nature. What it means to be human is to be that animal that knows itself to be experiencing the aesthetic enjoyment of nature. In this version, too, animals do not have this unique capacity, and ecological problems remain fundamentally human problems vis-à-vis their limits to the strictly human enjoyment of nature. The third version is constructivist. Constructivism is anti-humanist insofar as it rejects the idea of a human essence, in the place of which it puts human structures. The human being, for Marxist constructivists, is not a primarily ahistorical essence, but rather a historical product of social, political, psychological, economic, and linguistic structures. All human knowledge of nature is thus limited strictly by these structures. What nature really is, however, remains ultimately a thing in itself beyond the limits of all human structures. Nature and matter are what exceed or are left out of our structures, and this lack or failure is our only, albeit paradoxical, form of knowledge. Given the practical and theoretical success of these criticisms of Marxism, it is not surprising that their textual origins, Marx's writings, have suffered the same fate. Considering the volumes of criticism on Marxism, is it still possible to return again to Marx and his work to find new ideas? My argument is that it is not despite the success of these criticisms, but precisely because of their success, that the answer today is yes. The decline of Marxism makes possible a declination or swerve towards something new. In fact, this has already happened more than once in the history of Marxism. Once when the humanist young Marx of the 1844 manuscripts was discovered in the 1950s to swerve away from Stalinism, and again when the pre-capital Marx of the Grundrisse was discovered in the 1970s to swerve away from the young humanist Marx of the 1950s and 1960s. The argument of this book is that it is time for yet another swerve, this time to the least read of all Marx's works. The first Marx of his doctoral dissertation, to swerve away from both the humanisms of the 1950s and the constructivisms of the 1970s. Each shift was not exclusive, but operated as a lens through which the other works were reread and returned to. One always returns from somewhere, depending on the previous turns. Through the lens of contemporary physics, ecology, politics, economics, and Marx's doctoral dissertation, it is possible to return to Marx again and find new answers to the questions of our time. If Marxism is going to be responsive to the issues of today, it is going to have to move beyond the three criticisms just discussed. And I think it can. The underground current of kinetic materialism. Marxism is not a static doctrine of theses, but a continuously flowing current of theoretical practice. It is something taken up anew and transformed by each generation. Therefore, it is crucial to understand Marx today as part of a larger and longer tradition of philosophical materialism, of which Marxism is a subset. By explicitly taking up the tradition of ancient materialism in his doctoral dissertation, Marx saw himself as putting forward a new materialism, irreducible to all previous materialisms, both ancient and modern, including their vitalistic and deistic versions. Marx saw himself as putting forward a contemporary materialism for his time through an original reading of Epicurean atomism. Long before Marx had ever read Hegel, his first and original philosophical engagement was Epicurus. Before there was the Hegelian Marx, there was the Epicurean Marx, and since a major source for his knowledge of Epicureanism was Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, one could say there is a Lucretian Marx as well. Marx's intervention and contribution to philosophy can be situated within the longer tradition of an underground current, starting with Lucretius. This is the current of kinetic or process materialism. Lucretius was the first to interpret Epicurus in a completely new way, just as Epicurus had done to Democritus, as Marx was the first to show. Lucretius's novelty was that he replaced the discreteness of the Greek atom with the continual flow and kinetic flux of matter. This was not an insignificant move. Matter, for Lucretius, was not some thing in motion, as it was for modern materialists such as Francis Bacon and even Friedrich Engels. Matter, for Lucretius, was not subject to the kind of deterministic laws and empirical reductionism that defined most modernist versions of atomism, including classical physics. Although separated by more than 1,000 years, what Marx and Lucretius have in common is that they both read Epicurus in the same unique way, stressing the continually flowing, non-discrete, and kinetic features of matter, as I discuss in Chapter 1. Within this larger tradition of materialism, Marx was the first to herald a new materialism that gave historical ontological primacy to the stochastic motion of matter, opposed to its discrete interpretation in Democritus, Newton, and others. One of the arguments of this book is that Marx held a very contemporary theory of matter, on a par with recent, new materialist ones. Unfortunately, most of what is commonly known about Marx comes not from Marx, but from what other people have said he said. Hence the oft-cited claim by Marx, "What is certain is that I myself am not a Marxist." It is impossible to give a full history of the diverse reception of Marx in this introduction. However, not to provide at least a brief one would fail to properly contextualize the main interventions of this book. Thus, in the short sections that follow, I describe three major revolutions in the interpretation of Marx's work and their connection to the three main criticisms previously described. My intention is to identify where Marxism is today and foreground what problems need to be overcome. The First Revolution. Soviet Marxism. The first revolution of Marxism occurred during the early 20th century, alongside the rise of Soviet communism. Soviet Marxism drew on the work of Marx and Engels to provide a single set of universal principles or foundations for all future knowledge and social policy. The theory of dialectical materialism, or diamat, as it was formalized, was drawn from Engels's Dialectics of Nature and provided a synthetic and reductionist theory of all matter and nature. The law of a universal dialectic was formalized thus. 1. The law of the unity and conflict of opposites. 2. The law of the passage of quantitative changes into qualitative changes. 3. The law of the negation of the negation. The metaphysical view of nature was interpreted from Engels's Antideuring thus. 1. The unity of the world consists in its materiality. 2. Never and nowhere has there existed, or can there exist, matter without motion. In short, the aim of Soviet Marxism was to produce universal philosophical doctrines for Marxism that secured it as a fixed theoretical document and a doctrine of state governance. In doing so, however, Soviet Marxism fell prey to all three of the criticisms described previously. The Soviets interpreted Engels's theory in Dialectics of Nature as universal laws of historical evolution and social development. They saw Soviet socialism as the final stage of world historical development. They reduced the historical philosophy of nature to metaphysical propositions about the being of nature forever and all time. In doing so, they reduced the activity and creativity of matter to a passive servant of metaphysical laws. Above all, they followed an aggressively productivist anthropocentrism, especially under Stalin. Nature was industrialized and treated as a mere storehouse of raw materials. The Second Revolution. Humanist Marxism. The second revolution of Marxism occurred during the early 20th century as a response to the Soviet appropriation of Marxism for deterministic and reductionist ends. For many years, Marx had been criticized in France because of his association with Soviet authoritarianism. However, in the 1930s, Marxism began to return again under the aegis of the recently published Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, written by the young Marx. This occurred alongside the rise of French Hegelianism, championed by Alexandre Kojève and Jean Hippolyte. Students of this return, such as Henri Lefebvre, Lucien Goldman, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, found in the young Marx none of the rhetoric of economic determinism and historical reductionism. Instead, they found a new discussion of human being and social alienation, uncontaminated by economic formulas, historical doctrines, and Stalinist political terror. The more humanist and anti-Soviet writings of George Lukács, Karl Korsch, and Herbert Marcuse circulated widely. The new existential and phenomenological traditions in France and Germany from the 1930s to the 1960s were increasingly combined with Hegelian Marxism in the works of Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, Walter Benjamin, and others associated with the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research. However, the Frankfurt School differed from the existential and phenomenological interpretations and took up a position against any kind of bourgeois or socialist human essence, historical universalism, and unilateral relation between the base and superstructure. This second revolution, although split between widely differing interpretations, decidedly rejected the deterministic and metaphysical Marxism of Engels and the Soviets in favor of an approach grounded in sensuous human practice. The nature of human existence was to be free from any deterministic laws of nature, history, or matter, although human existence also tended to find itself everywhere constrained by social structures that alienated it from itself. In this way, Humanist Marxism overcame the problem of determinism. However, although it rejected economic reductionism, it still held on to an existential and psychoanalytic reductionism in which the relation between base and superstructure was merely reconfigured around human-centric social psychology. Even if they differed on the question of humanism, phenomenological and Frankfurt School-style Marxism both made little attempt to conceal their overt anthropocentrism. The Third Revolution. PostStructuralist Marxism. The Third Revolution of Marxism occurred during the 1960s and 1970s as a response to the humanist neglect of the larger structural conditions of capitalism and the hierarchical centralization of the Communist Party itself. In Italy, for example, the autonomist Marxists emphasized the idea of living labor as the heart of political and social, not just economic, life. Living labor has the power not only to work, but to play, to live, and self-organize outside the structure of the factory, union, and party. Autonomism created social movements distinct from and in contrast to political parties. Their revolts were against authoritarian socialism as well as contemporary representative democracy. The 1970s also saw the rise of Third World Marxisms, in which the division between colonizers and colonized became the main axis of struggle and analysis. Class division was not fundamental, but derived from colonial relationships, first and foremost. At the end of Capital, Marx suggested that one should expect to see in the projects of colonization the geographical rebirth of primitive accumulation and the historical techniques of capitalism again and again. Third World Marxism takes this seriously as the starting point of critique and resistance, and not class antagonism. Feminist Marxism during this time rejected the male worker-centric interpretation of capital by emphasizing the assumption that only waged male workers were laborers. In fact, women's cheap or free work is fundamental to the capitalist mode of production and thus cuts to the heart of where value comes from. In French Marxism, Louis Althusser initiated a new return to Marx and began to reread the later Marx of Capital. His reading focused on the relations and forces of production against the young Marx of the manuscripts, which focused on human essence and alienation. Althusser, Étienne Balibar, Roger Establet, Jacques Rancière, and Pierre Macheret co-published Reading Capital in 1965, which emphasized the non-deterministic and non-reductionist nature of the structure of capitalism, but also the way in which capital itself shapes and produces the human subject. Most famously, Althusser argued that there was an epistemological break between Marx's earlier work, influenced by German idealism and classical political economy, and his later work, which introduced an entirely new philosophical system centered around the production of knowledge. Knowledge, Althusser argued, was produced through problematic or conjectural historical sites, entirely independent from the ideological superstructure. Althusser definitively broke with the deterministic and reductionist Marx, as well as the humanist Marx. Later, post-structuralist Marxists such as Gilles Deleuze, Jacques Derrida, François Lyotard, Alain Badiou, and Michel Foucault were all influenced by Althusser, but also diverged from him in significant ways that I cannot address here. With respect to the major axes of criticism described here, however, the important commonality was that Althusser, the post-structuralist Marxists, autonomists, post-colonial Marxists, and feminists all largely returned to a definitively new Marx without historical determinism, economic or materialist reductionism, or humanism. The human subject was something that was completely dissolved into the various social, linguistic, unconscious, historical, political, geographical, gendered, and economic structures. The human became simply the site or terminal of an intersection of one or more interlocking social, gendered, or geographical structures. However, and importantly, all these social structures, gender, race, politics, etc., or assemblages, apparatuses, relations of force, and so on, are human structures, outside of which nothing can be said or thought. In the post-structuralist treatments of Marx, then, Marx remained an anthropocentric social constructivist of one variety or another. Marx and the philosophy of motion. Each of these revolutions overcame a problem posed by the previous interpretations, but only by introducing another problem. The aim of this book, therefore, is to provide a reading of Marx that tries to overcome all three of the problems previously described without having to go outside Marx's own writings. In particular, the charge of anthropocentrism has proven to be the most entrenched in all three major interpretive revolutions. It has therefore become the focus of much recent criticism from such new materialist philosophers as Jane Bennett, Bruno Latour, Manuel de Landa, and Rossi Bradotti. New materialists even interpret post-structuralist Marxism as hopelessly old materialist and anthropocentric alongside the three criticisms already discussed. However, Marxists have also been quick and right to point out the political limitations of any sort of new materialism that would leave Marx and political economy behind altogether. Despite their apparent incompatibility, I think these two traditions have much to gain from each other. This book is the first attempt to bring Marxism and new materialism together in the hope of revitalizing Marxism for the 21st century. Efforts have already been made in this direction. To my knowledge, however, this is the first book-length work on this topic. At the same time, this book is also meant to make an important contribution to the broader return of Marx to the popular political imagination. In short, I hope to make the case for a new materialist Marxism, non-deterministic, non-reductionist, and non-anthropocentric. In particular, What this book adds to the long tradition of underground kinetic materialism in general, and to the recent interest in Marx and new materialism in particular, is a reinterpretation of Marx as a philosopher of motion. If taken seriously, this simple, and for some intuitive or naive, approach is the methodological key to overcoming the three criticisms of Marxism previously listed. For some, Marx's interest in motion might even appear to be so obvious that it is not worth saying much more about. But that is precisely the problem. It is all too well known that Marx is always talking about movement and motion, and that dialectics is the science of movement. However, what is not so well known, or at least not agreed upon, is exactly what Marx meant by motion and why it was the key to his new materialism. At the core of all three axes of interpretive criticism discussed previously is a particularly problematic interpretation of motion that I argue does not accurately reflect Marx's own theory of kinetic materialism. Accordingly, and this is the most ambitious claim of this book, each interpretive revolution has fallen prey to the historical criticisms mentioned, in part because it has not sufficiently theorized the nature and primacy of motion in Marx's work. When I first began researching this topic, I was shocked to discover an almost complete lack of scholarship on the topic of movement, motion, and mobility in Marx. Why had an almost ubiquitous theme in Marx's work, such as movement, not been the primary object of at least a few studies? I think there are at least three major reasons for this lacuna, which I address in this book. Engels. First of all, Marx's theory of motion has been neglected because of its historical association with the more metaphysical and scientific theory of matter in motion, associated with Engels's Antideutung and dialectics of nature. Unlike Marx, Engels adopted a specific historical theory of matter in motion along the lines of 19th-century classical physics, which was committed to a mechanistic theory of discrete, particle-like bits of empirical matter. There has thus been a tendency in at least recent scholarship to avoid this topic in favor of less metaphysically burdened ones. The Soviets. Second, and relatedly, Marx's theory of motion has been neglected because of its doctrinal appropriation by Soviet Marxists. The Soviets, perhaps more than anyone else, were responsible for adopting Engels's theory of matter in motion and insisting it was also Marx's, when it was not. In principle, this is only a theoretical error, but practically and historically, Stalin tied this interpretation directly to his practice of terror and authoritarianism. After this, no humanist or post-structuralist Marxist wanted anything to do with such metaphysical and Soviet-tainted theories of motion and matter. The Doctoral Dissertation. Third, Marx's theory of motion has been neglected because hardly anyone reads or writes about Marx's doctoral dissertation and his notebooks on Epicurean philosophy. However, they provide the single most concentrated theory of matter and motion in his oeuvre. Unfortunately, Marx's doctoral dissertation and Epicurean notebooks remain among the least read and most marginalized of all his works, for several reasons. The dissertation was unpublished during Marx's lifetime, was missing its last two chapters, was only published in German as recently as 1927, and was only published in a complete English translation in the collected works as late as 1975. Only recently, in 2004, was an abridged English translation made available at an affordable price. Therefore, the neglect of Marx's theory of motion is in part a result of the late arrival and inaccessibility of its primary source material. However, even after the doctoral dissertation and Epicurean notebooks were published, there was a lack of interest in them, and even an active burying of anything in Marx's oeuvre that smacked of metaphysical materialism, German Naturphilosophie, Soviet-style doctrines of nature, and so on. Furthermore, lack of interest in the doctoral dissertation might also be attributable to the fact that it is so different from Marx's other writings that it is not obvious at all how it has any connection to the privileged early manuscripts and mature capital that dominate the humanist and post-structuralist traditions, respectively. The technical details of Greek and Latin classical philology hardly seem relevant to the imperatives of the class struggle, ecological collapse, colonialism, or anything else. Even when Marxists have returned to Marx's theory of nature, matter, and motion, they have tended to either avoid the doctoral dissertation, as the Frankfurt humanist Alfred Schmidt does in The Concept of Nature in Marx, or reject Marx's conclusions altogether, like post-structuralist Gilles Deleuze. For example, Deleuze explicitly subordinates matter and motion to force in his book on Nietzsche, contrasting himself and Nietzsche with Lucretius's and Marx's kinetic materialisms. The thesis of this book. The thesis of this book is that Marx's theory of kinetic materialism is the key to overcoming the three major problems of Marxism previously identified. This is a bold claim that will require the length of the book to demonstrate, but in place of a full defense of my interpretation, I give the listener here the short version of three core contentions to be proven. Kinetic dialectics. Marx's theory of motion rejects deterministic theories of nature and society. Matter does not follow mechanistic, vitalistic, classical, or any other deterministic laws of motion. History is not predetermined, linearly developmental, progressive, or teleological. Furthermore, there is no historical necessity for party, state, or vanguard politics, nor any necessity for their absence for revolutionary praxis. In contrast to deterministic or law-governed motion, Marx proposes, first in his doctoral dissertation, and then throughout his work, a pedetic or stochastic theory of what I call kinetic dialectics. Pedesis is a kind of physical motion that is neither strictly necessary nor strictly random. Each new motion is directly related to the previous one, but is not determined by the history of motions leading up to it, or even strictly by the motion immediately prior. Pedetic motion has no teleological end goal. For Marx, there are no universal laws of nature that matter passively follows. Matter itself is active and creative. Laws are emergent tendencies in nature. Historical materialism. Marx's theory of motion also rejects the economically reductionist division between base and superstructure. Not only is there no merely causal relationship between the two, but there is also no interaction between them. There is, strictly speaking, no material division between them at all. The transformations and co-productions of the two domains are collectively self-caused or self-moved. There is only a kinetic transformation and redistribution of the whole historical situation. Furthermore, Marx's theory of motion is in conflict with any reductionist theory of matter. Marx's theory of motion in his doctoral dissertation and Epicurean notebooks provides a rejection of all atomistic theories of matter. There are no discrete particles following universal natural laws. Marx's theory of motion completely conflicts with both crude mechanistic and strictly empirical theories of matter, as well as contemplative or speculative metaphysical theories. Marx has no metaphysics of matter or motion. Unlike typical interpretations of Greek atomism, Marx was the first modern thinker to reject the discrete interpretation of matter in favor of continual and pedetic flows. Unlike other modern interpretations of atomism that treated atoms as eternal and unchanging, Bacon, and reintroduced God, Gassendi, or vitalism, Cavendish, Marx was the only one who dared to treat matter as a kinetic process, and thus reject any reductionist or substance-based theory of what matter is. Marx thus provides a decidedly anti-classical theory of matter much closer to contemporary quantum theories than most Marxists have hitherto considered. Matter, for Marx, is not reducible to actual, observable empirical matter, not because it is speculative or ideal, as in Democritus, but precisely because matter is in motion and flux. Matter is not reducible to sensuous things or substances because it is the condition for sensation itself as a process. The irreducible primacy of motion at the heart of matter persists throughout Marx's work and resists all forms of reductionism. Historical ontology. Marx's theory of motion is not an ontology of matter or of motion. It is a historical ontology. Marx grounds his kinetic materialism neither in a metaphysical theory of matter in itself, nor in a strictly anthropocentric or social practice of how matter is for us. For Marx, there is no ontological division between nature and society. Marx's theory of matter, instead, is strictly grounded in praxis, but praxis is not something only humans do. Human theoretical practices of describing nature are always embodied and historically situated. Philosophy relies on the material conditions of its inscription, but so do non-human practices. In other words, this position is distinct from two common positions in contemporary Marxism. On one side, it is distinct from anthropocentric constructivism or social monisms, which argue that human descriptions of matter are anti-realist and can say nothing about matter or nature in itself outside capitalism. On the other side, it is distinct from metaphysical theories of how nature or matter is, in itself, forever and all time. Between anthropic constructivism and naive realism, this book argues that Marx was a non-anthropocentric realist. Human descriptions of nature are nature describing and changing itself in one way or another. But other natural beings are also entangled with one another in a transformative way. Nature really constructs itself. Marx's ontology is thus historical in the sense that it is a real description/transformation of nature from a certain region of nature. In the future, matter will change and new positions will open new regions of nature. Marx provides us with an ontology that is entirely regional and yet also realist at the same time. For Marx, there is no ontological dualism or interaction between humans and nature, nor is there a simple monism either. Rather, there is a multiplicity of folds or knots. Marx does not give us a flat ontology in which the agency of matter is equally distributed horizontally, like the fraternal relations of bourgeois liberalism and various new materialism political theories. Rather, he gives us a twisted ontology in which different regions of matter are unevenly developed and circulated. This book, therefore, presents neither a humanist Marx nor an anti-humanist Marx, but rather a new materialist Marx of uneven material agencies, an entangled and kinetic Marxism. These are some of the main claims this book aims to prove in its return to Marx. I do not expect that the listener will find these theses to be immediately obvious. If they were, there would be no need to write this book. However, since it is my aim to refrain from merely supplementing Marx's work with other theorists, I ask for the listener's patience and goodwill until I can demonstrate whether these theses sink or swim through a close reading of the texts themselves, especially if the listener is not well versed in Marx's doctoral dissertation. I think some very surprising discoveries and unexpected connections to Marx's later work await them. I am not arguing that Marx's dissertation is the key to the true Marx, only that it is an important missing piece of his philosophy that may help us resolve some contemporary difficulties in Marxist theory more generally. Method. This book is structured along 4 methodological lines. Close reading. First and foremost, this book is structured by a close reading of Volume 1, Chapter 1 of Capital, in which Marx puts forth his intended and fully edited core theory of value, upon which his whole theory of the capitalist mode of production rests. However, in preparation for this close reading, I first look at his theoretical framework of motion and kinetic materialism, initially put forward in his doctoral dissertation and Epicurean notebooks. Once I have identified this guiding methodological thread throughout several of Marx's books, I use this method to read a number of key concepts in Capital from this new perspective. In other words, motion is not a local dispute or something that hinges on a line or two in one of his books. I am arguing that it is something completely integral to the entire core of Marx's thought and touches upon every aspect of it. It is what makes Marx's work and methodology so absolutely original and heretical in the history of Western philosophy. The aim of my close reading is not to pick and choose quotes favorable to the arguments of this book, but to confront difficult and contrary passages head-on. My aim is also not to provide a creative reinterpretation that merely floats above Marx's text, but to go line by line and show the nuance and consistency of my interpretation in Chapter 1 of Capital. These aims are achieved by staying as close to the core text as possible and supporting it with relevant material from his collected works. Translation. This leads to my second methodological line. Translation. This book offers not only a fresh interpretation of Marx, but also a few novel interventions regarding the English translation of the German text. In general, I have tried to pay special attention to the kinetic valences of Marx's vocabulary, especially where the English translation does not show this plainly enough. Since I cannot comment on all these interventions here, I simply draw the listener's attention to a few of the most important and interrelated German words that guide my translation and interpretation. The first translation intervention is that I have highlighted a kinetic and conceptual connection between 3 important and interrelated German words in Marx's vocabulary: Zusammenhängen, Wechsel, and Verkehr. Marx uses these 3 words extensively throughout his works to describe the continual process of kinetic entanglement among different matters. Zusammenhängen literally means to hang together in mutual and interrelational support, but is unfortunately translated as connection or conglomerate, which covers over the idea of mutual intra-action. Wechsel means to continuously change or fold, and is used to describe the continuous flux or fold of matter, or Stoffwechsel, which is often translated as the more technical scientific term, metabolism. Marx also uses the word Wechsel to emphasize when actions or effects Wirkungen, fold back into each other in a kind of immanent feedback loop or continual transformation of the whole. Wechselwirkung. Finally, the term Verkehr is an interchange or intercourse, and Marx uses it in such a wide variety of contexts: economic, military, semantic, and sexual, that it seems to be connected to the process of mutual transformation previously mentioned. Throughout this book I have tried to show how these three words and their important kinetic meanings function as a guiding preoccupation in Marx's work from the Doctoral Dissertation to Capital. My second translation intervention is that I have tried to develop all the interpretive valences included in the rich German verb tragen. Although typically translated as to bear, tragen also means to support, maintain, carry, give birth, bear fruit, wear clothing, take, and drag. This is an important set of meanings because Marx places them at the heart of his theory of value. In the form of society to be considered here, they, use values, are also the material bearers, Träger, of exchange value. Marx says that before the creation of value, there must be use values that support and maintain the material conditions of value. In other words, the material bearer, Träger, supports and maintains, tragen, value. Bearing is not only an active and kinetic term, indicating the birth origins of value in movement, but also refers directly to the constitutive labor of nature, women, animals, and slaves. This is the supportive activity that is appropriated by capitalism. This idea is crucial for reinterpreting Marx's theory of value as continuous with his theory of primitive accumulation. Argumentation. There is also an argumentative method followed by this book. Marx did not follow Engels's approach to the dialectics of nature, but had his own materialist dialectics. Marx's dialectics was quite different and based on an original philosophy of motion. After Lucretius's reading of Epicurus, Marx was the first to give the movement of matter historical ontological primacy, untethered by the static constraints of the typical interpretations of Greek atomism. Such a controversial thesis, I admit, is not immediately transparent and will entail more than a few battles with prevailing paradigms of contemporary Marxism. This book therefore contains a number of argumentative lines of reasoning alongside its more close readings and translation interventions, not from a love of polemic, but to show at each step the novelty and force of the readings and translations that support the larger theses of this book. However, there is a limit to this method of tying close reading with argumentation. The core theses of this book remain tied strictly to the close readings. In other words, this book does not attempt to extend its arguments beyond the texts considered, although I believe it is possible to do so, just not in a single book. My reading will not and cannot be extended here because of the length and depth necessary to textually support arguments of this kind. How far it can be extended must remain an open question for future work. The arguments presented here are therefore not universal or synthetic arguments that speak for the whole of Marx's corpus or aim to reinterpret or defend everything Marx has ever written. With the exception of identifying a movement-oriented methodology through his works, the scope of most of the arguments of this book pertains, at least for the moment, exclusively to Chapter 1 of Capital, although I have also drawn in support from the rest of the collected works to show that such an argument could, in principle, be extended and elaborated more broadly. History. The fourth and final methodical line of this book is historical. My argumentative thesis allows me to demonstrate a new historical resonance that has recently emerged between Marx and the present. Every new epoch changes the conditions in which the past is understood. New lines and legacies are drawn up constantly. In particular, the current historical conjuncture at the turn of the 21st century, post-colonial global migration, ecological collapse, global feminism, makes a new reading of Marx both possible and urgent. Marx is not a relic of history. All that was solid has now fully melted into air, just as Marx had anticipated. The world is more mobile today than ever before, and more than Marx could have imagined. Thus, Marx continues to speak to us as a contemporary of a world in motion. It is now time to return his work to the surface of our world and allow the underground current of materialism to erupt once again.